Welcome back to an introduction to writing philosophy. This lesson will focus on the overall structure of a philosophy paper. So by the end of this lecture, you should know the 5 main sections that a typical philosophy paper will include, understand the main role that each of these sections play, as well as the overarching reason for organizing our writing along these lines, and then be ready to take the first steps to outlining each of these sections of your paper. Now, as you may have noticed, we are right at the halfway mark in this series of videos. We are at the end of the planning and preparation stage, and we're now about to enter what we could call the drafting stage of writing a philosophy paper. By this point, you have selected a topic to write about, done your research, honed your thesis statement, and developed a valid argument in defense of your position. You have, in other words, the main ingredients of a philosophy paper. So now it's time to mix them all together. But how do we actually go about doing that? Well, that's what I'll cover in the next several videos in this series. You'll see that there's a video for each section of a philosophy paper, from the introduction to the conclusion. One thing I would say is that if you've ever taken any kind of writing class before, you may have been told that an essay consists of an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And maybe broadly speaking, the same template could sort of be mapped onto a philosophy paper, but I would also say that it leaves out a few important pieces. Because remember that part of the purpose of a philosophy paper is not just to report on other ideas. It's not a book report. It's not even just about persuading your reader to consider your side of things. It's also to show that you've considered other sides of the issue, other arguments, and that your own view, your own position, and your own argument can withstand criticism. So there's a little bit more work involved in doing the kind of writing that philosophy calls for. So the 5 main sections of a typical philosophy paper is going to include an introduction, which gives your reader an idea of what to expect from your paper, and also helps you as a writer to keep yourself grounded throughout the writing process. A context and background section, which provides the necessary background information that your reader would need to understand in order to follow the topic that your paper is on. And it's also the place where you would introduce any kind of important terms or concepts that need to be defined. And again, this helps you as a writer because that way you don't have to keep going back and being like, oh, I forgot, I have to tell you what this term means, and oh, who's this person that I'm talking about? You can get a lot of that done in this context and background section. Next, there's going to be the argument and exposition. This is really like the meat of the philosophy paper. This is where you present your argument first in a more condensed form, a formalized version of it, and then you go on to give an explanation and a defense of each of your argument's main premises. Then comes the objections and responses section. And this is where you consider counter-arguments to your own and show why these other arguments have failed to move you from your position. Finally, there's the conclusion. And this is where you reaffirm what you set out to accomplish. And you also end with something for the reader to take away, whether that's a new way of thinking, a new way of acting, or both. As I like to do, I think it's important to talk about the purpose of whatever it is that we're talking about in these lessons. What is the purpose of structuring a paper in this way? And more importantly, what is the purpose of setting aside time that you could be spending on actually writing the thing to writing an outline? What is the rationale behind outlining in the first place? Well, we have already touched on the purpose of outlining in at least one previous lesson. That would have been the lesson on pre-writing, which is different from writing an outline. In that lesson, we talked about some of the obstacles to writing that students and even longtime writers of philosophy encounter. A few of these being a lack of focus, a lack of direction, logistical issues, and so on. One of the ways that outlining can mitigate some of these problems is by breaking the writing process into smaller steps that are easier to manage. It's easier to focus on one thing at a time rather than looking at it as this one big monumental task that has to be completed in one shot. That's really not the way that writing philosophy or writing any kind of project works. So for instance, let's say you find yourself struggling with one particular area of your paper. Well, sometimes it's helpful to set that part aside and work on a different area. This is one of the tips that I gave in the pre-writing lesson, but of course, this is only possible to apply if you already know what other areas of your paper that need work. So instead of looking at it like, oh my gosh, I have to write 1,500 words or 3,000 words in some cases, maybe more, it's more like, well, I haven't worked on my objections and responses section. I know I need to do that, and I've already written most of my argument and exposition. So what were those objections and responses I was planning to write about? Oh, I just go and refer to my outline, where I already have them written down. So outlining, much like pre-writing, can seem like extra work at first, but in the long run, it actually saves you time later down the road. And if you're in a course that has deadlines, this can become increasingly important as you get closer and closer to hitting that due date. But doing a solid outline beforehand can really help, especially if you're one of those students who finds themselves submitting assignments at 11:58 p.m. the night before the last day of class. Finally, having a solid outline can be really helpful to submit to a professor or to anyone else that you're working with for feedback on your planned paper. In fact, some courses may even require that you submit an outline for a grade or to move on to the next assignment. But even if that's not the case, being able to hand someone a page or two of what your paper is projected to look like in the form of an easy-to-read outline, that can really make a difference if, for instance, you end up getting feedback like, hey, there's this major problem with what you're planning to do, and you kind of need to resolve that before you move on to something else. Like, that's not a bad thing if it happens necessarily, but it is definitely better to get that kind of feedback earlier on in the process rather than later, rather than after you've invested all this time into writing. And again, if you're taking a course where you have deadlines and such, definitely the kind of feedback you want to get early on, not when you have like 1 or 2 days left in the class. So maybe the biggest takeaway here is that outlining saves you time in the long run, and it helps keep you on track throughout the whole of the writing process. So this was kind of a short video. That's because it's just giving like an overall introduction to the outlining phase of the writing process. Now we're going to move into the lesson videos that focus on one section of the paper at a time. You'll see in the playlist, it'll say introduction, context and background, argument and exposition. Looks like I'm running out of space on the camera. Objections and responses, and then finally the conclusion. So I'll see you over there. Thanks.